All right, welcome everyone to today's weekly Cluster API Provider Azure office hours. It's Thursday, November 3rd. Cluster API and Provider Azure are a subproject of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We're part of the CNCF, so we abide by the golden rule, and we ask that folks be kind to one another, raise their hands if you want to speak, and all in all, lean in and have fun and enjoy the community. So at the beginning of the meeting is when we pause for a brief time to allow folks to introduce themselves. So if you'd like to do that right now, please feel free to raise hand and I'll recognize you and you can say hi. Okay, fair enough. I do see lots of familiar folks, so hey everybody. I am going to drag this document over and share my screen. Can we see the Google Doc? George, I see you're raising your hand.
Hi, how's it going? It's Jorge. Sorry, I couldn't
Jorge.
find the raise hand button, but introduce myself. Jorge Luna. I work at Microsoft, and my first time attending this call, trying to learn a little more about what's going on here. So good to meet everybody.
Great, thanks for coming and thanks for saying hi. Welcome, Jorge. Hopefully we'll see you again. And yes, it'll be 5 minutes before the next person who can't find the raise hand feature probably speaks up. Sometimes it's very tricky. I'm screen sharing now and I have no idea how I'll find it. So luckily I'm the host, so I can just talk. Okay, wonderful. So let's get to discussion time. I'm reading through this agenda and it looks like we've got a little bit of linear time cognitive test there. So we'll do milestone and we'll do milestone at the end, but we can start, I think, by enumerating through this open discussion list. I'm going to nominate that we do test grid status first, because that might be the most interesting. There might be some folks who actually showed up just to hear about that. So let me actually I'm going to provide the visualization. I'm not sure what happened there. If I change tabs, can folks see test grid?
Yep.
Wonderful. Semester lifecycle. Cecile, I think you added that line item. If you want to narrate, go ahead.
You probably have more context than I do. I just thought it'd be good to kind of get an update for people who weren't following closely what was going on yesterday.
Okay, cool. So I know there's at least a few folks in this meeting who have sort of comparable context. So please feel free to interrupt and add more context. I'll do my best to sort of describe the backstory. So I think the easiest way would be to go into this full main list. So there's actually a lot of things going on. So the first place to start might be Azure Bastion. So Azure Bastion depends on some backend Azure certificate services that have been under duress. I haven't checked in this morning to see if that's resolved, but this green, sorry, that's going to be the private cluster. This red pass or fail from, that's 11.2. Okay. So that's one thing that we've been managing. We merged a PR last night. Thanks, I think, Cecile, for doing that later in the evening. So PR should be unblocked from that failure. So if I go ahead and open up a PR, here's one actually from 2 hours ago. Did this get a test run? It didn't. Let's see, this one may have gotten some test run. All right, looking at the wrong PRs. So one of the things that's been blocking folks is in these test runs, this is the sort of main end-to-end job that runs as part of PRs. And prior to a change from last evening, the private cluster scenario was a required job as part of this battery of tests. And I don't see a lot of information here. But unless I hear otherwise, I expect that this is now clean. I don't know if we have I'm going to go from test grid. I'm going to go to the PR history and see if I can find gotta find the test.
It's the red one at the bottom.
Red one at the bottom, yes. Okay, so we did have a successful test run yesterday evening, so that's great. So I'm confident-ish that if you're rebased against the latest main, that test job is unblocked. So that's one thing to talk about for a test grid. Anyone want to add any more context or questions? I'm going to open chat here, see if I can.
That one that's running right now is mine. I just rebased it, so that's a good canary to watch. Hopefully I'm sure it'll pass, but if it doesn't, we can freak out.
Okay, cool. So yeah, just for the community, that essentially yesterday and potentially the evening prior, Tuesday evening, at least West Coast Pacific time, the CAPZ PR train was effectively blocked because of an Azure outage. So I can't confirm that the underlying certificate service is restored, but the test that we ran that depended on that is no longer part of the required suite. So we have a follow-up task to track the progress of that outage and then reinstate that test coverage, but that we can do that in the coming days. So the next interesting thing to talk about in terms of test grid is a novel test that we created to try to triage what's going on with the AKS cluster end-to-end test. So more specifically, if we look here, we do see a green here, but there is a lot of this line that I'm highlighting here. There's a lot of red really consistently over I'm spanning into 2 weeks basically at this point. So over the last couple of weeks, we're seeing a lot of red, and we've done some investigation, and the bulk of these failures, if not all of these failures, are on cluster delete. And we spent some time, some of the folks, John and myself and Willie and Cecile and probably Matt, because we've been seeing this off and on for months, trying to figure out what's going on with the delete. Is there actually something in CAPZ that is regressed where deletes are taking a long time, or is there something in the end-to-end test suite that's regressed? We can't reproduce this locally easily, and more importantly, we don't see this on PRs. So, I know Mike's here and maybe some other folks who've submitted PRs against the Azure Managed Cluster feature surface area where they're running AKS end-to-end tests. These tests are reliable in PRs, as far as I can tell, over the past weeks and months. So our periodic job that runs nightly, actually it runs 2 times a day right now, is giving us these failed tests. So in response to that, we have suggested that maybe there's something interesting about running this AKS test as part of a larger suite of tests. So as we can see here, these periodic job runs include 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 end-to-end test scenarios. Off the top of my head, I think we have the concurrency tuned to 3. So they're running, I think, 3 at a time, sort of in sequence. So yeah. And as a result of that hypothesis, we forked, so to speak, a new periodic job that just runs the AKS test yesterday, and we configured it to run hourly so we get lots of test coverage. And as we can see, it's like entirely green. I'm not sure what happened here. This might be a prow. Prow is the one actually passed. So maybe it's something failed when measurements were posted, and so we've lost that test run resolution on this dashboard. But it looks to me like we basically have 100% success over the last, I'm not sure how many that is, 12, 16 runs. So that's really good evidence that the AKS test itself is fine. which is great. That's great news. And also that the specifics of that end-to-end test is fine. But something about running 9 cluster tests at a time is not fine. So I'm happy to open that up to observation. I'm not sure we can make any breakthroughs here in the community meeting, but I think that that's sort of the learning that I'm going to take away from this little experiment in the last 24 hours. Does anyone have any thoughts on this? All right, cool. So anything we do, we'll post in public Slack. Anyone on this call, feel free to lean in, or if you know someone else who's interested in this, definitely want to make this a collaborative public performance. Go ahead, Cecile.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say, there's one more class of failure also that I think John has more context on, but for the external cloud provider, that's the one that started being green again after 1031. You wanted to
Well, there's
cover
in
that.
fact, there's actually 2 more classes of failures, but I'd be happy to let John explain that one.
Yeah, I can go for that one. So for the external cloud provider test, which one is that? Anyway, that one was failing pretty consistently starting, I don't remember exactly what day that was. But the
Yeah,
cloud
here's the
provider,
data right here.
Yeah.
It's this. Yeah.
Yep. So for that one, the Helm chart that we install, that is the actual cloud provider, was defaulting some images that were failing to be published because those were failing their own end-to-end tests. So new images, so first to compensate for that failure, we pinned the images to the next latest version that we actually knew was published. And that started getting the test to pass again. And then in the meantime, we were waiting for those new images to get pushed, which they did, I think, yesterday or the day before. So I opened a PR to revert that fix pinning the images. And Jack, I think that was the PR that you were looking at earlier in Prow that didn't
I
have a
see.
whole lot of information. So yeah, I'll need to look into that to see why that test didn't seem to pass.
It looks
But yeah,
like your
that
PR
one,
from yesterday got merged. Here we go.
yes. Mhm.
So that's great. So this includes a reference to a working, is it 123 that was not published for whatever reason?
Yeah. Mhm.
Cool. And so for some context, this test that we're looking at on this column uses the official upstream cloud provider Azure Helm chart to install the out-of-tree cloud provider. So John fixed essentially updated the chart here in this PR to revise upwards the versions of cloud provider Azure that are referenced in that chart in response to a set of new releases from the cloud provider Azure project. Cool. Thank you so much. And then I think this is the final thing. If folks are tracking all this at home, there was a regression in the VMSS scenario recently. We only got 2 here, so this is a little bit gnarlier, I guess, in PRs. So the VMSS cluster scenario has been testing a Kubernetes application layer security scanning tool called Kubescape. I think that's the best way to describe it. So that was really good opportunistic coverage for that particular set of test dimensions, but it regressed a couple, 36 hours ago or so. Matt, I think you disabled that, and that has set us back to green. So there's a little bit of to-do item to figure out what we want to do with Kubescape going forward. We've had a couple of scenarios where it's suddenly started failing for unexplained reasons, and it seems like we don't have the expertise to really support Cubescape at present, but we have an issue to track that, so it's not something that we should entirely ignore. So hopefully we'll be able to re-enable that at some point in the future. I think that was a lot of information, so please feel free to ask questions. If not here on Slack, we're here to help. But it's been a interesting couple of days in terms of tests. Okay. So, Cecile, do we think this is the stuff that I added is going to be fairly long, I feel like, and so I would love to just front load this sort of thing. Is this something we can discuss right now? Do you think?
Yeah, so this one is I guess a little bit time sensitive in the sense that just looking at the milestone, I was speaking before the meeting, we had set the date for 1.6 for next week. So we should probably be thinking about that and talking about that and seeing if we still want to do a release next week. And if so, what's needed if we're in a good place. Obviously the tests are kind of blocking right now, but I think we have that under control at this point. So
Yeah, I agree. Let's just quickly take a look at what 1.6 looks like from our point of view. So this seems like a lot of stuff. So I would imagine if we're going to do this next week, we're going to kick the bulk of this out. So let's maybe do a go, no go in terms of is a 1.6 release without this set of work items acceptable? So let's go
Click
one at
on
a
the-
time here. Go
Click
ahead.
on the closed column, there's a lot in there.
Yeah, we've got 45. So I think that we've got enough change to do a monthly release. But maybe if there's anything here that just can't get kicked out, say 5 more weeks, because that's the practical effect. At least any of these that are features. Right. So does anyone have any context on this one? This looks like a bug. So actually, if it's a bug, I'm going to skip over because that can be cherry picked. So I think that's less urgent in terms of this conversation.
Yeah, Jack, I think that's a bug. I had assigned it to myself for some time, but then I couldn't get onto it. So one of the community member got onto it, and I think he's working on it.
Cool. This looks like the kind of bug that we can, I mean, I'm not digging into it deep, but it looks like something that we could cherry pick in.
yeah, definitely.
Okay. I think I can. This doesn't seem like something we would need to include in a release. So I'm going to skip past that. Please interrupt me if I'm being a little too subjective and okay. Add new upstream. I think that I feel the same way about this. Anyone else feel free to disagree. So this is this a PR? This is not a PR. I know I did some work on this. Did I not link work? All right. Let's see if I have an open PR. Okay, I don't think any of these are related. So I think the one I'm thinking of that's bouncing around in my working memory has been merged. And let's see if I can find it.
I think I remember the one you're talking about that did merge. Yeah, that's that one. I don't know if that one was like complete for that issue though. I think that issue was more generic.
Right. Well, this issue is if I recall, this issue was added before a sort of deep dive, before I did a deep dive into essentially the async code in particular, and also SDK behaviors. And after that deep dive with you and John, I determined that there's not actually a lot of work to do. And I think I feel confident that this is the amount of work that we want to do. This is linked to an audit of Retry After on behalf of the Azure Managed Cluster stuff. So I felt like that was an important thing before graduation. I just think I failed to close it. So I'm going to close this now. I'm happy to provide more of a defense if folks are skeptical if this is the right thing to do. Okay, cool. Back to milestone. Okay, so that's fine. I'm going to not worry about that now. This proposal may evolve beyond this milestone. I think that's fine. Cecile, do you have anything to say about this one?
Yeah, I can speak for that one. So Ashutosh is working on it, but he's not here right now. I don't think this is the kind of thing that's going to get done in the next week. I think he's working on a proposal last time I checked. So this should be milestone next, probably.
We feel okay about that in terms of,
Yeah.
we don't want to block 1.6 for this. It's not appropriate.
No, definitely not. If we did, we would probably block it for the next 6 months. So
Cool.
this is a more long-term effort.
Got it. So maybe there's a better way than opening up a new tab and doing that manually, but.
Oh, I think you can, if you select on the checkboxes for all the ones you want to kick out of there.
Change the milestone.
Yeah, once you select a checkbox, it will show up on the left.
Okay, cool. I feel like this one is almost ready. Does anyone else have any recent review context on this? I see it has a rebase. Are we calling this a bug?
It's
So
a
this is a
feature.
feature that's a bug. Yeah, seems like a feature
yeah.
based on the description.
I had some comments that were unaddressed at the end, and I guess it needs to be rebase.
Okay, well, I'm gonna assign. If you assign that's like a review, I'm gonna assign this to myself because I think that this sounds like something that may be able to be included before 1.6. So I'll try to prioritize reviewing this. Does anyone have any thoughts on this being required for 1.6? Cool.
I have a thought that in general, I don't think anything should be required unless it's a critical bug that's introduced as part of the release. I think any feature, we shouldn't be holding releases for features in general.
Okay, cool. So on the same note as before, this one I think that we can do by the end of the week. So I'm going to assign myself, and I can lean in on that. It's great. We've got some community participation there. Do we feel confident that this can be moved to the next milestone?
Yeah, so that one, we do have a bit more of a, I guess, time constraint on it in the sense that the AD pod identity project that we currently rely on was officially announced as deprecated, I think, last week. So we really need to get on it because at this point it's not getting maintained anymore. I think I need to check with Ashutosh on that one, but he's also assigned to that one. And I think if you scroll down, there are updates at the bottom, but
Yeah, so essentially I guess the question would be, are we comfortable releasing a 1.6 with the deprecated AD pod identity, or do we want to wait? Do we want to push back 1.6 in time for this? Does anyone have any thoughts?
I think we kind of have to. This is also one of those that's going to require like pretty non-trivial work.
Okay.
Because
got it.
we're
So
essentially
if we were to delay
changing how
1.6, we might
identity
just delay
works.
it a month or two, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think this one is high priority. We should mark it as like something we definitely want to do in the next milestone or in the 1.7. And if Ashutosh needs help, then provide help. I don't know if anyone else, sorry, I kind of spoke without raising my hand. Does anyone else have any thoughts or context?
Okay, cool. All right, so this is. Let's just go ahead and do the right. I still can't find a way to. If I do milestone, edit mount, no. Okay, I'm gonna move these two bugs out of this milestone. Because since we're doing this work, let's just go ahead and make this as correct as we can. Matt, do you have anything to share on this in terms of progress? It's like literally ready to land.
That's just an issue. It's not the PR, so I don't know if anyone's picked it up or not.
Got it. Cool. This sounds like it'll be next. And I'll set this to be next. And I think this is fair. So we'll aim to land these in the so when is the release exactly? Oh, November 9th. So we'll aim to land these in the next few business days. Okay. Going once, going twice. Next topic. That was productive. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Oh, this is controversial. Actually, this reminds me, seeing this Ginkgo V2 requirement, I'm going to move that out of this milestone because that sounds like it's not going to be finished in the next couple of days. Do you agree, Matt?
No, actually, well, I put that thing on the agenda because I realized Cappy's going to have release, and in the back of my mind, since I did the Ginkgo stuff in Cappy, I just wanted to make a PSA. But
okay, let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and lean into this topic. So
yeah, but yesterday, Furkat from Ericsson put out a PR that's pretty complete and actually deals with the Ginkgo V2 thing. So I don't know that we have that much to talk about with this topic.
Cool. Are there any test infra ramifications of making that switch?
That's a good question. I don't think so.
I suppose we would know. I mean, the test would tell us if.
Right. I don't think so, because like it's up to CapZ to fetch Ginkgo and other tools and all that. I think that's outside. Yeah, we would find out pretty quick, but I don't know.
Okay, cool. So the TLDR for the community is that this should not affect anything at all. It just makes the adoption of CAPI 1.3 a little trickier than it normally would be because there's some sort of under the hood end-to-end test refactoring going on. But you're suggesting that refactoring is fairly light touch.
I haven't dug into his PR yet, but it looks like he's dealt with it comprehensively. So I think we'll work it out here.
Okay, cool. So I guess PSA to anyone who has end-to-end stuff in flight, there might be a rebase in your future. Okay, cool. So is it just these topics. Okay, this is one has been delayed for several meetings. So I'm gonna go ahead and nominate this to be next, just so I can spend a little public time discussing it. I'm gonna visualize this by opening up it was previously conveniently located here, but now I moved it, so I have to go find it again. I'm gonna open up my proposal PR. Graduation. No. Here we go. Evolution, I see. Okay, cool. Different words. All right, so I want to go through some of these and just, formally get some airtime on these assertions, opinions. Going through this in detail is probably not required, but just this is some background context to remind folks who are interested in this that we are currently implementing managed cluster in CapZ via a composition of the control plane and cluster API CRD resources. So that provides some challenges because they don't those don't match neatly to the AKS API. And I think that in discussions with other cloud providers, they don't map neatly to those managed services as well, EKS, GKE. So there's a challenge here in terms of how do we define an API for our users? I mean, really for cluster API that is consistent across providers and is consistent with respect to the underlying APIs that they abstract away. So there's some background here about that. I'd be happy to answer any questions on that. But really what I want to go to is, actually, this is not what I want to look at. Sorry. I do want to, it was in the second page. This is what I want to look. So that was useful background context. So hopefully that was communicated. But what I really want to do is go down a list of proposed prereqs that we can agree upon for graduation. And I'll put this PR in the agenda so folks can refer to it. So I'm going to do this. And use this as a visual aid. Okay, great. So let's go down this list. The first list is was put before this landed. So this is landed. This is the proposal that is in CAPI that was shepherded primarily by Winnie and was in response to an observation that the various providers in the cluster API ecosystem were not consistent in their managed Kubernetes approach. So that proposal landed, which outlined, I guess I can also do this. This proposal outlined a few different options and then had sort of reached the conclusion that there are two options in the current CAPI ecosystem that makes sense for managed cluster providers. So I can go into detail if folks have questions about that, but we were tracking that and we declared that landing this proposal was a prerequisite to the CAPC Azure Managed Cluster graduation. So that has landed. So this prerequisite has basically been fulfilled. There's more interesting stuff around that proposal, but I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip down to the rest of these to make sure that I communicate these proposed prereqs here. So, and in fact, actually, number two, I guess I'm going to be forced to describe that because number two has to do with the sort of blast radius of that proposal. So in that proposal, the two options that I listed that were sort of recommended as sort of blessed by Cluster API. CAPC currently has the implementation of Azure Managed Cluster, and CAPC fulfills one of those. But the proposal also prefers another one. And it's described here where the Azure Managed Cluster resource gets more of the API surface area compared to Azure. Well, I'm using Azure. So this proposal is CAPI. And so the TLDR in the proposal in terms of the most blessed recommended option is to put more of the API front end in the cluster resource as opposed to the control plane resource. So that would require some work for CAPC. So when I originally wrote this proposal, we assumed that we would follow that best practice recommendation and make those changes. Since then, in practice, the folks who are actually writing that proposal in anticipation of applying those changes in Kappa in the AWS cluster API provider have sort of changed their expectations of how that's going to land in Kappa. So without going into too much detail about that right now, I mean, I'd love to go into tons of detail in a different discussion. This is open for discussion. So this may or may not be a part of this prerequisite list. Before I proceed, does anyone have any questions, or is that not clear? Cool. Wait, 2 more seconds for raise hand latency. Okay, cool. All right, so this is going to be a little bit more concrete now. Those two are very abstract. All right, so this prerequisite has to do with ensuring that the Azure Managed Cluster solution that we sort of stamp as graduated beyond experimental is able to accommodate the entire AKS surface area. So I tried to express this in a way that clarified we're not going to implement every feature, but we want to spend a lot of time sort of spiking on the various types of AKS features to make sure that the current API that we have right now, the sort of API surface area in the existing Azure Managed Cluster can be accommodated and evolved without breaking to accommodate those features. So some examples of this concretely are the private preview. There's a whole set of AKS private preview features which are actually not static. So it's a constant sort of moving feature front door for AKS, which makes sense. Some of those private preview features are experimental and never actually graduate. In the best case scenario, the feature graduates, in which case it is no longer in the private preview surface area. So doing this will require some, John and I have spent a little time exploring this. It will require some very painful SDK changes to CAPC, the way it communicates with Azure. But our exploration of that so far has not suggested that we need to break the API for our users. So that's an example of things that we want to do and feel confident about before we consider graduation. So to the extent that we discover a non-implemented AKS feature that requires us to break Azure Managed Cluster in order to implement, we want to break that before we graduate. So that's what that prerequisite item is attempting to express. Does anyone have any questions on that? Okay, cool. So this is essentially outlining an audit of all of the ways that Cluster API defines lifecycle state mutation. And we want to audit all of the existing AKS features and potentially opportunistically look at other AKS features that are not implemented and make sure that there isn't anything surprising in the way that we can pair Cluster API's architectural opinions about how to manage, create, read, update delete on top of the AKS API's architectural opinions about how to do create, read, update, delete. Again, I don't think this is going to yield anything, but it's really important that we do this work, because if we find that there's a feature that is either not fully working and needs some CAPC breaking changes, we want to find that out before we graduate from experimental. This fifth is actually related to that earlier PR, if you were paying attention. So I think this is essentially closed. So that's great. But because the AKS, so a little bit of background context for Azure, I think we've got enough time. I tend to talk a lot. So we've already been concerned with making sure that the CAPC calls to the Azure APIs are optimized so that we don't exceed subscription request limits across a variety of dimensions. With the introduction of AKS, we now have sort of doubled the opportunistic surface area for that scenario, because we're not only just now calling the sort of like raw compute storage network APIs in Azure, but AKS itself has its own set of limits for requests when we call the AKS APIs. So it seemed to me important to make sure that we ship a API that allows us to continually optimize this. And so again, like these other line items above, to a large extent, this is an audit to make sure not that everything is perfect, because nothing is ever going to be perfect, but that we spend enough time investigating how we're going to continually maintain this without having to break the API. So if we discover like, okay, this needs to be optimized in this way, which is going to result in a breaking change, that's the kind of thing we want to front load and do right now instead of after we graduate. But that work has actually been done, I think, at least to my satisfaction. And so I think we could feel good about that. That's great. And then the final thing, this is probably the most concrete, is that I am advocating that we significantly increase our end-to-end test surface area for Azure Managed Cluster before we graduate from experimental, because I anticipate that there is stuff that doesn't work right now. That's usually what happens when you don't have full end-to-end test coverage. And I would love to discover that before graduation, because there's a non-zero chance that some of that breakage will require something inconvenient for users in order to address. And so I would like that inconvenience to happen before we graduate. Any questions on any of that? The next one's also very interesting. Okay, cool. So this final open question has to do with the machine pool spec. So because AKS only, is it correct to say only? I think AKS only supports VMSS and Azure. So VMSS is Azure's sort of machine set service, first class machine set service. So it's a way of defining a VM recipe and scaling that out horizontally in Azure. AKS only uses VMSS to run its nodes, and the cluster API abstraction equivalent of that is machine pool. Machine pool is still experimental. So we have this open question of, do we graduate something that uses an experimental cluster API feature from experimental? There's a sort of like meta question there. I don't know that we have an answer to that. I think the key practical question is, what will the evolution of Azure Managed Machine Pool be, which I'm highlighting here, if the evolution of machine pool, because it's still an experimental, if this evolves in a breaking way, are we able to protect our users against that breakage as they define their cluster templates? I think the answer is no, which is the most sort of urgent reason why we would want to graduate this before we graduate the set of Azure managed cluster features. Does anyone have any thoughts about this? I'm not saying we're going to solve this now. Really, this is just to present the sort of set of criteria. Does anyone have anything to say about Azure managed machine pool or machine pools? Go, Cecile.
Yeah, the way I see it, it's not that the features have a like the graduation has a dependency on each other. I think they should be able to be graduated independently. But if our goal is to provide a stable experimental free experience to the AKS users of CAPZ, then we'll need to do both. So I see them both more as like two steps and two required items that we need to get done if we want to get to that stage. But I think graduating the AKS, like at least removing the AKS feature flag, in my mind at least, is not something that has a dependency on the machine pool feature state.
Right. So you see this more as a customer story where you want to be able to tell customers that you can safely run your production on CAPZ Azure managed or Azure managed cluster because the whole surface area is non-experimental. Go ahead.
Well, so I just want to nuance what you just said. I don't think the experimental state has anything to do with like being able to run production. So the AKS service itself is fully GA and supported and all of that. So you should be able to run production already. It's more that the API of CAPZ is subject to change and is subject to breaking changes until we remove that experimental state. So to me, the experimental feature flag doesn't really convey anything in terms of like production readiness or stability. It's more the API, like the CRD itself, is not protected by the same guarantees as the other APIs, and also the feature as a whole. We theoretically, on paper, we have not committed to keeping it in the repo. So that means like we could decide, oh, well, this feature was an experiment. We don't think it's worth keeping. Let's remove it. That's not going to happen with managed clusters, obviously, because we're here. But that's what that feature flag communicates, I think, to users.
Got it. Do we have any updates on, and you think that applies to the machine pool? So.
Yep.
Do we have any updates on machine pools?
Azure.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say in Azure, machine pool is just backed by VMSS, right? Which itself is a fully GA supported product. So it's not that machine pool itself is unstable. It's that the machine pool API in CAPZ and CAPI, or mostly in CAPI at this point, is not fully stable. And I'll stop talking and let Matt answer the other question because he probably has more to say than I do.
About machine pools? I'm sorry, what was the question specifically?
Well, I just want to, I think that's an important clarification that so could I ask you, Cecile, to add a comment to this? Because it sounds like we want to change this. It's not a dependency to graduate Azure Managed Cluster. We don't depend on this graduating, say, first of all, which is normally what dependency would mean to me.
Well, that's just my opinion. Like others might see it differently. I guess the only thing I'm saying is like I don't think we should wait for machine pool and then like make AKS non-experimental. For me, it's not like there's no dependency in that sense, but I think machine pool graduation should absolutely be part of this document in the sense that it's part of the work we need to do to get to a stable, no experimental AKS feature. Does that make sense? I guess 100%. I'm differentiating the feature flag aspect from the overall like story, like the epic of we have stable managed clusters.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely grant you that this is only your opinion, but I highly value your opinion being a part of this thread. So I would love for this to be slightly modified based on this conversation. I think that you added a lot of really good value there. So, and then Matt, for you, if you can answer this question, is there concurrent effort going on in CAPI for machine pool graduation?
I think it's not as coherent. We've made a few changes, but it's really kind of gated by the machine pool machines feature is my guess. I'm not going to say there's no effort, but I don't think it's coming together quickly.
Can you add more color around what you mean by machine pool machines?
At this point, we've merged the proposal, but the implementation is lagging quite a bit. That for machine pools to behave the way we want them to, in order for cluster autoscaler, at least in order for the cluster API autoscaler backend to support machine pools the way it does machine deployments, we need representations of individual instances. Those are what we're calling machine pool machines, which is really fun to say a million times. That hasn't landed yet, and I think most of CAPI would agree that that's something we want to see before machine pools themselves are GA.
I see. Okay, so the machine
It's
pool
not- it's
machine
not
that we have in
something we could-
Azure is not a CAPI CRD. We have our own.
And that's, yes, and that's further confusing. We have an existing machine pool machine implementation in CAP Z that is not strictly related to that proposal. We will rejigger the existing Azure machine pool machines to fit the new proposal. That's part of the work I still have to do. But yeah, I mean, it's more that if we graduate machine pools to GA status, we wouldn't be able to do this change afterwards, not reasonably. It's too big a change to make to a GA feature.
Okay, there's definitely some follow-up here. It sounds to me like this is actually more interesting than I even thought it was. So like we should probably have more people working on this because it sounds like we have definite known breakage once the machine pool CAPI spec lands, which is going to include machine pool machines, in that we are going to have to change in the Azure surface area our Azure machine pool machines. So we basically have a known breaking API change coming our way. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, but Azure managed machine pool and all the Azure stuff isn't really exposed API in my estimation. I mean, it's going to change, but ideally the changes that are required to implement the CAPI proposal are sort of behind the scenes, shouldn't be breaking, but I could
Okay,
be wrong
well,
about that. And I
cool,
agree with
let's follow up
Cecile
on
that too. Ideally, Azure managed cluster and Azure managed machine pool aren't strictly dependent on each other.
Go ahead, Cecile.
So not strictly related to this, but more in general, just taking a step back. I think this is all really great. I think everyone kind of agrees those are all things that we want to do as part of graduation. I think, how do we want to track this? Because the question I keep getting from users, like all week at KubeCon and just talking to people, is how do I know how much, like how close we are and how much is left to do? And I know we've talked about having a project board in the past. Like, are we still planning on doing that? What's a good way for someone to say, I want to help with this, where can I start? And also to see like how much progress has been made versus how much work is left.
Right. Well, so depending on how effective I can be at getting eyes on this document, if this is more or less complete, then to me, we can just completely lean into this in terms of what you're describing. So we can create a project board and we can just make sure every single part of the Azure Managed Cluster feature surface area has end-to-end test coverage. And I think that can be something we can federate to lots of people really effectively. But I do think there's a possibility that there's some omissions here that folks will want. So we want to get more people reading this and providing that feedback. So I'll work on that. But we can do that. I mean, in the meantime, we can just create a project board and start enumerating the list of missing test coverage.
So are you saying that none of the other 5 items need work or like concrete issues? Like, why are you focusing on number 6 as like the only thing we need to start working on? I guess is confusing to me.
Because I was thinking along the lines of issues that we could conveniently hand off to people to pitch into. I think the other ones are I mean, these aren't issues necessarily. These are more, each one of these is sort of an epic. So this has been done. This is going to require this is going to require a working group to figure out what we do going forward here, whether we integrate these changes. If there is work here that comes out of this, then that could potentially be stuff that we could divide up. If there's no work that comes out of this, then we can just mark this as done. Go ahead, Sil.
Yeah, I think this all makes sense, like for us, because we're day to day in the project and we know exactly what's going on with these. I think my concern is more from the point of view, I'm just putting myself in the shoes of someone who's new to the project, who doesn't know about the history of the proposal and how do I look at this and know whether there's any chance of this graduating in the next 6 months? Like, how do I know whether I should take a dependency on this, whether I should use it, or how ready the feature is to use? I think that's just what we're missing here, is like that visibility.
Right, you don't. This document does not carry that information in any form.
Right. So what's our answer to that? Like, how do we, like, is that something we want to be doing separately in an issue or in a project board?
I think if we want that, then we add a section at the end of this, which points to a project board that has definitive status of, you know, so this could be, this is the high level strategy. And here is the detailed tactical information, which includes every single issue. Once every single issue is closed, then that means that we're graduating.
Yeah, I think that would be super useful, like either that or a milestone or something that can help people glance of, like, you know, like the percentage progress.
Cool.
I don't know if others who aren't like working on this, who are, I don't know, like not to pick on people, but I see Joachim, you're in the meeting and I know you're interested in this. Like, is that something that would be valuable to folks?
Hey, yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely will be valuable to understand, you know, the process. And yeah, I mean, definitely, I'm not speaking just for myself, but also, like, you know, in the team, we have, you know, Jorge and AK. I know AK has been very involved in the meeting. So yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Yeah, I will reach out for some, I'll solicit help and reach out for some PM support. Because to a certain extent, this is a reflection of my inability to effectively PM. Just kind of baked into my profile. Part of the ABCs of me, unfortunately, or fortunately, because I have other things that are good. But thank you I mean, I can only imagine how maybe this didn't land as a set of interesting things. I wanted to talk about KubeCon. We had a ton of great conversations around this at KubeCon, but we're over time. Yeah, everybody's come around. Thanks everybody for listening. Are we done? I'll stop sharing here. Okay, see everybody next week.